The German Shepherd wouldn't stop howling at midnight. What they dug up gave everyone chills. Some stories don't just pass the time, they touch the soul. A loyal friend, a fragile moment, and a bond that speaks louder than words. If this story touches you, like, share, and subscribe, because kindness is worth spreading. It was midnight in a small American town, the kind of town where nights usually passed in perfect silence. The streets lay empty, the windows dark, and only the distant hum of crickets filled the air. Yet on this night, something shattered the calm. A German shepherd stood in the middle of an open field on the edge of town, his head thrown back, howling endlessly at the sky. His cries cut through the stillness like a knife, long and mournful, echoing off the houses until lights began to flicker on one by one. People stirred in their beds, uneasy at the sound. Some stepped onto porches, pulling coats over their nightclothes, trying to see what caused such desperate noise. Whispers traveled quickly down the quiet street. Whose dog is that? Why won't he stop? Something's wrong. For some, the sound sparked only irritation. A man slammed his window shut, muttering angrily that a dog had no right to wake the whole town. But others shifted nervously, clutching their robes tighter, because they felt something deeper in that howl, a warning, a cry that seemed almost human in its grief. The German shepherd did not move from his place. His paws dug at the dirt, his fur bristling under the pale light of the moon. Between each howl, he growled low in his throat, circling the same patch of ground as though guarding it. The field itself had long been forgotten, overgrown with weeds and littered with stones, but tonight it had become the center of chaos. Every cry from the dog seemed to shake the soil itself, carrying an urgency no one could ignore. By now, half the town was awake. Curtains twitched, shadows moved across windows, and voices rose in the dark. Some thought the dog had lost his mind. Others, the older ones who believed in things not easily explained, whispered that dogs had a way of sensing what humans could not. "He's seen something," an old woman murmured as she leaned on her cane, her eyes glistening. "Mark my words, he's trying to tell us." But still, no one dared step closer. The shepherd's howls grew sharper, louder, tearing into the night air. They were not the calls of an ordinary dog. They carried fear, sorrow, and a kind of urgency that set the heart racing. Even those who scoffed at superstition could not shake the feeling that something lay hidden in that field, something that had been waiting for this very night to be uncovered. A storm cloud rolled slowly across the sky, veiling the moon and casting the field into darkness. The wind picked up, rustling through the weeds, carrying the smell of damp earth. And still, the German shepherd howled, his cries rising and falling like a warning bell. Children buried their faces against their mothers, frightened by the sound. Men stood stiff on porches, torn between anger and unease. And all the while, the dog never stopped. What was he calling for? The townsfolk wondered. What was buried beneath that soil? No one knew yet, but they all felt it, the chill that crept into their bones, the unshakable sense that something was there, waiting. And when the truth finally came to light, it would move the entire town and leave them trembling in disbelief. The town was the kind of place that rarely made the news. Nestled between rolling fields and quiet forests, it was a small American town where everyone knew everyone, and where life moved at the gentle pace of seasons. Mornings began with the church bell tolling softly across the rooftops, and evenings ended with neighbors sitting on their porches, rocking chairs creaking as they traded stories over the sound of cicadas. Tradition ran deep here. Families had lived on the same streets for generations. The bakery still smelled of fresh bread before sunrise, and the local diner still served coffee so strong it could wake a man from a week's worth of sleep. It was a town built on simple routines, where silence was as much a part of life as the rhythm of the train that passed by once a day. But lately, Silence had been broken in a way no one could ignore. At midnight, when the town should have been resting, a sound rose that unsettled every soul. It was the cry of a German shepherd, a long, piercing howl that cut through walls and reached deep into dreams. At first, people thought little of it. Dogs bark, they told themselves. Maybe he had spotted a raccoon or smelled something in the wind. But night after night, the howling returned. And it wasn't the playful barking of a restless pet. It was haunting, mournful, a cry that seemed to claw at the bones of anyone who heard it. Before long, the dog's midnight howls became the talk of the town. The butcher grumbled about being woken from his sleep, his voice sharp as he slammed the screen door of his shop. Mothers hushed their children who cried out in the dark, whispering that it was just a dog and nothing more. Yet behind closed doors, people confessed their unease. Something about the sound didn't feel normal. It wasn't just noise, it was as if the dog was warning them, begging them, or mourning something unseen. Neighbors began to argue. Some said the dog's owner should keep him inside, tie him up, or muzzle him. Others, especially the older folk who still clung to stories of omens and signs, shook their heads and muttered, "Leave him be. Dogs know things. They see what we can't." At the diner, conversations grew heated. One man swore the dog was mad, while another insisted that animals could sense spirits lingering in places people had long forgotten. Coffee cups rattled as voices rose, but no one could agree on what the truth was. The spot where the dog howled became a source of gossip. It wasn't far from the edge of town, a stretch of field overgrown with weeds and surrounded by old fence posts that leaned like tired shoulders. Few people paid attention to it before, but now everyone knew it as the place where the shepherd calls. Some said the earth there felt colder than the rest of the field. Others claimed they had seen their own pets refuse to go near it. Cats bristling, horses pulling back, even the bravest farm dogs turning in the opposite direction. Stranger still were the drafts. People who passed near the field late at night whispered about sudden chills, as though icy fingers brushed their skin even on warm summer evenings. One farmer admitted that when he tried to cut across the field on his way home, his lantern blew out though there had been no wind. He never walked that way again. The howls only grew louder. Midnight after midnight, the German shepherd returned, throwing his head back and crying out to the moon as though demanding that someone listen. At first, people grumbled about sleepless nights. But soon the tone of their conversations shifted. Complaints turned to unease, unease turned to whispers, and whispers turned to fear. Children spoke in hushed voices about the dog who wouldn't stop. Grown men paused on their porches, staring at the field longer than they cared to admit. And still, the dog never stopped. No matter the weather, no matter the night, his voice carried across the town, leaving behind a question that no one dared to answer out loud. What was he trying to tell them? The German shepherd's name was Titan, and in many ways, it suited him perfectly. He was strong, broad-shouldered, with a thick coat of black and tan fur that gleamed under the sun. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and loyal to the man who owned him, a quiet farmer named Henry who had raised Titan from a pup. To the townsfolk, Titan had always been more than just another dog. He was a protector, the kind of animal that seemed to carry wisdom in the way he moved, a silent guardian who belonged not just to Henry but to everyone who lived nearby. But in recent weeks, Titan had changed. His loyalty had not wavered. If anything, it had grown stronger, more insistent. He began spending long hours near the field at the edge of town, the same field people had started to whisper about. At first, Henry thought it was nothing more than a passing interest. Dogs, after all, caught scents and followed them. Perhaps Titan had picked up the trail of a rabbit or a fox. Yet this was different. Titan didn't chase. He didn't wander. He stayed in one spot, circling, scratching at the earth, and then throwing his head back to howl into the night. Henry tried to pull him away, tugging firmly on the leash. But Titan resisted, his muscles tense, his claws digging into the soil. "Come on, boy," Henry muttered more than once, frustration creeping into his voice. "Ain't nothing out here but dirt." Yet Titan would not budge. He strained against the leash until Henry gave up, his own arms aching from the pull. Even when Henry managed to drag him home, Titan paced by the door restlessly, whining and pawing until the farmer relented. Within minutes, Titan was back at the same spot, his body pressed low to the ground, nose quivering, ears alert to sounds no one else could hear. Neighbors began to notice. From their porches they watched Titan's nightly ritual, whispering to one another in uneasy tones. Some said he had gone mad, that perhaps age had turned his mind. But others, especially the old women who kept rosaries by their bedsides, shook their heads. "Dogs don't lose their senses without reason," one murmured. "He knows something. They always do." The whispers grew louder as Titan's behavior grew stranger. He stopped eating regularly, his appetite fading as his focus narrowed to that single patch of earth. His paws grew raw from digging, his nails chipped, but still he returned every night, scratching, whining, howling as though his very soul demanded it. Henry, bewildered, began to worry. He took Titan to the local vet, who found nothing physically wrong with him. "Healthy as ever," the vet said, shaking his head. "But he's trying to tell you something. I don't know what it is, but I'd listen if I were you." Henry tried to dismiss it, but deep down he couldn't. Titan wasn't just any dog. He was steady, disciplined, almost uncanny in his instincts. He had once dragged Henry away from a falling tree limb seconds before it crashed to the ground. Another time, he had stood guard outside a barn until Henry realized smoke was seeping from the loft. Titan didn't act without cause. That was what made his obsession with the field so troubling. Soon, the villagers began to share their own stories. A boy swore he had seen Titan digging so furiously one evening that his paws bled, yet he never whimpered, never slowed. A young mother claimed she had walked by the field with her baby stroller when Titan suddenly lunged forward, placing himself between her and the ground, growling low as though protecting her from something unseen. "Dogs sense things we do not," the villagers whispered in hushed voices. "If Titan won't leave, it means something is there." And yet, no one wanted to test that theory. People kept their distance, crossing the road rather than passing too close to Titan's chosen spot. Pets tugged at their leashes, straining to avoid the area. Horses refused to plow near the edge of the field. Even the air seemed colder there, the soil darker, as though the earth itself was keeping a secret. Henry grew more desperate, torn between worry for his loyal companion and dread of what he might find if he listened. He scolded Titan, pleaded with him, even tried chaining him farther from the field. But every time, Titan broke free or found his way back. His howls pierced the night like clockwork, carrying over rooftops, slipping into dreams, unsettling every heart in town. Some nights Henry stood beside him, holding a lantern, staring at the same ground Titan would not leave. The wind rustled the weeds, shadows shifted across the soil, and Henry felt a shiver crawl down his spine. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" he whispered. Titan looked back at him, eyes glowing in the lantern light, then pressed his nose against the earth once more. Whatever secret lay beneath, Titan would not abandon it. His loyalty ran deeper than fear, deeper than hunger, deeper even than the bond that tied him to Henry. Something called to him from below, and he would not rest until someone else heard it too. The town had grown used to Titan's midnight cries. Doors closed tighter, curtains drawn earlier, as though shutting him out could soften the unease that crept into every home. But there were always eyes watching. One set of those eyes belonged to little Emily, a 3-year-old girl with golden hair tied in loose curls and a simple blue dress that brushed her knees. She was too young to carry the weight of fear that the adults whispered about. For her, Titan's howling wasn't frightening, it was sad. One afternoon, when the sun was low and the fields glowed with amber light, Emily tugged at her mother's hand as they walked past the edge of town. Titan was there again, crouched low, his nose pressed to the ground, his chest rumbling with a sound that was halfway between a growl and a cry. His ears twitched, his tail stiff, every part of him locked in focus. Emily stopped and tilted her head. "Mama," she asked softly, "why is he crying?" Her mother hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Around them, a couple of neighbors paused, pretending not to listen but leaning closer all the same. No one had an answer. Adults didn't like admitting they didn't understand, especially not to a child. Emily slipped free from her mother's hand and took a few small steps toward the German shepherd. "What's under there?" she asked in her tiny, clear voice. "Who's he calling for?" The words sent a ripple through the small crowd that had gathered without realizing it. People exchanged uneasy glances, shifting from foot to foot. An old man muttered, "Children ask what grown folks are too scared to say out loud." Titan raised his head at the sound of her voice. His eyes softened, ears lowering slightly, but he didn't move from his spot. Emily crouched down in the grass, close enough to see his paws, rough and dirt-stained from nights of digging. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small toy, a wooden horse her grandfather had carved for her. She held it out with both hands, her innocence shining through. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can play with this if you're sad." The shepherd didn't sniff or nudge the toy. His gaze never wavered from the patch of earth beneath him. His chest heaved as another low howl slipped out, rising into the air with the weight of something no one could yet name. Emily's toy dropped into the grass, forgotten, as the little girl's brow furrowed. Even she could sense it. Titan wasn't asking for comfort. He was begging to be understood. Her mother rushed forward, scooping Emily into her arms. "Don't get too close, darling," she said quickly, though her voice shook. "He's busy." Emily leaned her chin on her mother's shoulder, her eyes still fixed on the dog. "But, Mama," she said softly, "he's waiting for somebody. Why won't anyone help him?" The question hung heavy in the evening air. No one answered. Some looked away, pretending to check their watches or tugging their jackets tighter. Others stared at the ground, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. Because deep down, they feared the answer. Titan wasn't simply restless. He wasn't mad. He was guarding something, or someone, beneath the soil. From that day forward, Emily's innocent curiosity added a new layer of unease. Every time Titan howled at night, the townsfolk no longer only heard a dog. They heard the echo of a child's voice asking, "Who is he calling for?" And it gnawed at them in a way that whispers and rumors never had. Henry, Titan's owner, tried once more to coax his dog away, kneeling beside him in the field. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his hand resting gently on Titan's back. "You've done enough." But Titan only lowered his head again, pawing at the ground with quiet determination. Emily's words had stirred something in Henry too. He could no longer shake the feeling that his dog was not just howling into the night, but crying out for someone long forgotten. Emily continued to ask her questions whenever she saw Titan. Each time, her voice was soft, sincere, carrying the innocence of a heart unscarred by doubt. And each time, the adults fell silent. They had no answers, only fear. The sight of a child kneeling near a grieving dog became the image that haunted the town. To some, it was eerie. To others, it was a call to courage. For in her innocence, Emily had said what none of them dared to admit. Titan was not howling for himself. He was howling for the truth. The storm rolled into town with a force that rattled windows and shook the shutters loose on old houses. Lightning tore jagged paths across the sky, illuminating the quiet fields in harsh flashes of white. The air smelled of wet earth and charged electricity, and every porch in town seemed to creak under the weight of worried eyes peering out into the night. Most people pulled their blankets tighter, hoping the storm would pass. But one sound cut through the thunder and refused to let anyone rest. Titan was howling again. His voice rose above the storm, wild and unyielding, echoing through the trees and bouncing off the cemetery wall at the edge of town. It wasn't the casual bark of a restless dog or the warning growl of an animal sensing prey. It was something deeper, a cry that seemed to come from his very soul. Each howl stretched long into the darkness, blending with the wind until it was impossible to tell where the storm ended and the shepherd's grief began. Henry pulled on his boots and coat, muttering under his breath as he stepped out into the rain. He had tried so many times to quiet Titan, to drag him away from that cursed patch of soil. But tonight was different. Tonight the dog's cries were more frantic than ever. The leash strained against Henry's grip as Titan pulled him toward the old field, water spraying up from the mud with each desperate paw. Neighbors stirred on their porches, lanterns flickering in the rain. Some shook their heads, annoyance written on their faces. "That dog's lost his mind," one man grumbled, pulling his coat tighter around him. But others stayed quiet, eyes wide, watching Titan with a mixture of fear and fascination. Because even the storm couldn't drown out the urgency in his voice. Titan clawed at the ground, his paws sinking into the soft, rain-soaked earth. Mud splashed onto his fur, streaking his legs dark, but he didn't care. His nails tore at the soil, sending clumps flying behind him, his howls rising higher, more desperate with every strike of lightning. His eyes glowed in the flashes of light, wild and determined, as though he knew something the rest of them couldn't see. The little girl, Emily, stood on her porch in her mother's arms, her blue dress damp at the hem from the rain that had blown across the wooden boards. Her small voice carried through the storm. "Mama, he's trying to save someone." Her mother hushed her quickly, pulling her back inside, but the words lingered in the air like an unshakable truth. The villagers could no longer pretend this was just madness. Something was happening beneath that soil. Something Titan refused to leave buried. Henry dropped to his knees beside his dog, his hands trembling as he tried to pull Titan back. "Stop, boy. You'll tear your paws apart." But Titan didn't stop. His growl turned into a whine, a sharp, broken sound that cut deeper than any thunder. His body trembled, his breath came in ragged bursts, and still he dug, as though his very life depended on it. Then, in a rare moment of silence between thunderclaps, the villagers heard it too. A faint sound, muffled, coming from deep beneath the earth. At first, they thought it was the storm playing tricks on their ears. But then it came again, a soft, desperate cry, like the whimper of a child or the weak yelp of an animal too tired to fight. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd, lanterns shaking in their hands. One woman pressed her palm to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Dear Lord, there's someone down there." The storm seemed to grow angrier, wind lashing harder, as if nature itself was trying to bury the secret again. But Titan only grew louder. His howls became a furious anthem, demanding that the world listen. He stood over the spot, his body rigid, his chest heaving, his paws raw and bleeding from the effort. Every muscle in him screamed with urgency. Henry stumbled back, his face pale, his heart pounding with realization. "He's not mad," he whispered. "He's been trying to tell us all along." The villagers stood frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. No one dared to step forward. It was Titan's howl that broke their paralysis once more, long, guttural, and filled with anguish. The kind of sound that forced even the most skeptical soul to listen. The faint muffled noise rose again from beneath the soil. This time clear. A weak scratching, a choked sob. Something alive. Something fighting. The storm raged overhead, but in that moment, every ear and every eye in town was fixed on that single patch of ground. The midnight disturbance was no longer just a dog's madness. It was a warning, a plea, a desperate cry for help. And now, the truth could no longer be ignored. By the time the storm began to calm, Henry could no longer deny it. Something was buried beneath that field. His hands trembled as he held the phone, water dripping from his coat sleeves. For weeks he had brushed Titan's behavior off as restlessness, trauma, or simple stubbornness. But after hearing those faint sounds with his own ears, there was no turning back. He dialed the sheriff's number with a shaky hand, his voice breaking as he explained the scene. Within 20 minutes, the soft rumble of a cruiser's engine broke through the rain-soaked silence. Headlights cut across the field, glowing against the fog that still lingered after the storm. Sheriff Daniel stepped out first, a broad-shouldered man with years of experience but a face lined with weariness. Behind him came Deputy Clark, younger, skeptical, and already muttering about wild goose chases. Lanterns and flashlights flickered in the hands of villagers who hadn't gone back to bed. Their breath hung in the cool air, eyes wide as they waited for answers. Titan stood in the middle of the muddy patch, his paws raw, chest heaving, yet his body still strong and unyielding. He growled low when the deputies tried to approach casually, as if warning them not to underestimate the urgency of the moment. Sheriff Daniels adjusted his hat and sighed. "Henry, I hope you've got a good reason for dragging us out here at this hour." Henry swallowed hard, glancing at Titan. "It's not me, Sheriff. It's him. He won't stop. He's been at this spot for days. And tonight," his voice cracked, "tonight I swear we heard something down there." The deputy chuckled under his breath, shining his flashlight on the ground. "What did you hear? A raccoon? Maybe a coyote trapped in a burrow?" But Titan silenced him with a sudden, thunderous bark that made even the seasoned officers flinch. His hackles rose, his body stiff with tension, his growl vibrating through the wet air. He stood directly over the spot he had been guarding, his eyes never leaving the soil, his claws scraping as if daring someone to finally uncover the truth. The sheriff frowned, his expression softening despite his skepticism. "That's not the bark of a dog chasing shadows," he murmured. He took a step closer, crouching down, pressing his gloved hand against the ground. The soil was damp and unsettled, claw marks fresh and deep. Titan leaned in, almost touching his nose to the sheriff's hand, then let out a low whine that sent a chill through everyone standing nearby. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" Daniels whispered. The villagers inched closer, their lanterns swaying. The little girl, Emily, clung to her mother's skirt, her blue dress wrinkled and damp from the rain. She spoke in her tiny voice, barely louder than a whisper. "He's saying someone's under there." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, trying to brush off the unease creeping into his chest. "Kids say things. Dogs bark at shadows. Doesn't mean there's anything down there." But his words lacked conviction. The longer Titan stood his ground, the more foolish the doubt felt. Titan suddenly threw his head back and howled, a sound so fierce and mournful that it silenced the entire crowd. It wasn't just noise, it was a demand, a cry that pulled at every heart listening. The sheriff straightened, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing. "Get me the digging tools," he ordered. His voice carried the authority of a man who had learned to trust instincts, even the instincts of a dog. Deputy Clark hesitated. "Sheriff, with all respect, we're standing in the middle of a field in the dead of night. You really think—" "I think," Daniels cut him off, his voice sharp, "that if this dog has been standing guard here for days, and if half the town claims they've heard something tonight, we'd be fools not to look." Titan barked once. Sharp, short, as if in agreement. His eyes glistened in the flashlight beams, unblinking, unwavering. The villagers murmured among themselves, fear and hope tangled in their whispers. Some crossed their arms, others clasped their hands in prayer. Henry dropped beside Titan, placing a trembling hand on his dog's back. "See, boy? They're listening now. We're not alone anymore." The deputy reluctantly fetched a shovel from the cruiser's trunk, shaking his head as he returned. "If this turns out to be nothing but a dead animal, I swear." But his voice trailed off when Titan pressed closer to the ground, whining again, pawing at the soil like he couldn't wait another second. The sheriff looked at the dog, then at the townsfolk gathered with wide eyes. "This isn't nothing," he said quietly. "This is something. I don't know what yet, but I can feel it." The air grew thick with tension. Even the storm seemed to pause, the rain softening into a drizzle, thunder rolling faintly in the distance. Every sound was magnified: the crunch of boots in wet soil, the metallic clink of the shovel, the heavy breathing of men and dog alike. Titan refused to move aside. He stood close, his nose nearly touching the shovel's edge, his body stiff like a soldier on guard. His growls rose each time the deputy slowed, urging them on, his eyes burning with a strange kind of knowing. The villagers watched in silence. No one dared laugh, no one whispered doubts anymore. Even the skeptics felt it now, that weight in the air, that sense that something hidden, something terrible yet important, lay just beneath their feet. For the first time, the sheriff met Henry's eyes and admitted what no one wanted to say aloud. "This isn't just a dog's stubbornness. There's something here, and we're going to find it." And with that, the digging began in earnest. The shovels struck the ground with a heavy thud, breaking the silence of the midnight field. Each strike sounded louder than the last, echoing into the still night air. Titan stood so close to the hole that Sheriff Daniels had to nudge him back, but even then, the German shepherd refused to move far. His golden eyes were locked on the soil, his ears pricked forward, his muscles quivering with urgency. Every time the digging slowed, Titan let out a desperate howl, the kind that sent shivers down spines and made the villagers clutch their lanterns tighter. The first layers of dirt were soft from the rain, and steam rose like mist as the shovels cut deeper. The damp earth released a chill that seemed to creep up the rescuers' arms, as though the ground itself was hiding secrets it didn't want to give up. The men worked cautiously, each breath puffing into the cold night, the crowd holding its breath behind them. Mothers covered their children's eyes, but even they couldn't look away. There was something terrifying, yet magnetic, about watching the ground give way beneath Titan's howls. Sheriff Daniels called for more hands, and soon even the villagers stepped forward. Men who had once dismissed the dog as crazy now dug with urgency, their palms blistering, their shoulders aching, but none willing to stop. The farther they went, the colder it felt. A draft of air seeped from below, unnatural and sharp, making everyone shiver. It was as if the ground was breathing, releasing something that had been trapped for far too long. Titan growled and pawed at the soil, sending clumps flying in all directions. His determination was fierce, almost human, as though he understood more than anyone else what lay beneath. Then one of the shovels hit something solid. The dull thud against wood froze everyone in place. The rescuers exchanged nervous glances, their eyes wide. Titan erupted with wild barking, leaping against the edge of the hole, his claws scratching at the loose soil to clear the spot. Sheriff Daniels knelt, brushing away dirt with his bare hands until the outline became clearer. It was a wooden surface, smooth in some places, jagged in others. A coffin. The murmurs spread quickly through the gathered crowd. Some gasped. Others whispered prayers under their breath. The little girl in the blue dress clung tightly to her mother's skirt, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. "Why is there a box?" she whispered, her voice carrying further than she intended. Her innocence only deepened the chill in the air. The rescuers pressed harder, clearing more of the soil. Scratch marks appeared on the coffin's surface, deep and desperate, like fingernails dragging against wood. They weren't old, they were fresh. The realization struck everyone at once. Whoever had been inside had tried to get out. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and even the sheriff, a man hardened by years of service, felt his stomach twist. His voice trembled when he said, "This wasn't just buried. Someone fought to escape." Titan's howling grew frantic, his body straining toward the box as if he could tear it open with his teeth. His cries were no longer just barks. They were pleas, raw and heart-wrenching, urging the rescuers to hurry. The deputy dropped his shovel and fumbled for a crowbar, his skepticism finally shattered. "We need to open it. Now." The rescuers pried at the wood, their hands shaking, sweat mixing with the damp soil on their foreheads. The air grew colder still, almost unbearable, as if something was rising up from beneath with each crack of splintering wood. The villagers huddled closer together, their lanterns flickering nervously. Then it happened. A faint sound drifted upward, muffled, fragile, but unmistakably alive. It was the softest whimper, like the cry of something weak and terrified. The noise silenced everyone. For a moment, even the wind stilled, and the only sound was the shallow, broken cry rising from beneath the coffin lid. Someone shouted, "There's someone in there!" And panic swept through the crowd. Mothers pressed their children against their chests, men shouted for the tools to move faster, and prayers rose louder into the night. Titan went into a frenzy, his paws clawing at the edges, his body lunging forward as though sheer will could free whoever was trapped. His howl pierced the night sky, echoing through the fields like a siren of urgency. The rescuers tore at the wood with renewed desperation. With each strike, the cries from within grew clearer. They weren't just whimpers anymore. They were weak scratches, faint movements, the unmistakable sound of life clinging to hope. The scratch marks on the coffin's lid no longer seemed like echoes of the past. They were proof of someone still fighting, still alive. The final nails gave way with a scream of metal, and the lid cracked open slightly, releasing a rush of cold, stale air that carried the smell of earth and fear. The rescuers recoiled at first, the stench overwhelming, but Titan forced himself forward, barking furiously at the gap, pushing his nose into the opening as though reassuring whoever was inside that help had come. "Keep going!" Sheriff Daniels roared, his voice breaking with urgency. The men pried harder, splinters flying, mud clinging to their clothes, until the lid was pushed far enough back for light to pour inside. Lantern beams flickered across the hollow space, revealing movement. A small hand twitched, weak and trembling. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. A child. The rescuers froze, their hearts hammering, unable to process the sight. But Titan didn't pause. He howled again, his cries filled with both triumph and desperation. He had led them here, and now he demanded they finish what they had started. "Dear God," one of the villagers whispered, her hand covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "There's a child in there." The rescuers surged forward once more, widening the opening until the small figure could be seen clearly. Dirt smeared the child's face, his lips pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow, fragile breaths. His eyes fluttered open for only a moment, just enough to glance at the light before slipping closed again. The crowd broke into sobs and prayers. Even hardened men who had seen too much wept openly. Titan let out a final, victorious howl that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his purpose was fulfilled. He had refused to give up, and now the truth had been uncovered, a miracle pulled from beneath the soil. The digging did not stop once the first glimpse of the coffin appeared. If anything, the rescuers doubled their effort, hands and shovels tearing at the soil with desperate speed. The crowd behind them had grown. More villagers poured in from the nearby houses, their lanterns glowing like fireflies in the darkness. Some carried candles, their trembling flames casting halos of light that danced over the field. The air buzzed with whispers, half prayers, half fear, as the townsfolk realized that what began as a dog's howling had turned into something far greater. Titan stood at the edge of the pit, his paws muddy, his fur damp from the storm, his throat raw from barking, but he would not leave. He barked and whined at every pause in the digging, his whole body vibrating with urgency. His eyes darted between the rescuers and the half-buried coffin, urging them, begging them, demanding that they move faster. It was as though he alone carried the knowledge that every passing second mattered. Sheriff Daniels climbed into the hole, his boots sinking into the wet earth as he knelt beside the coffin lid. His hands, calloused from years of work, pressed against the damp wood. The scratch marks were clearer now, running jagged across the surface like the signature of desperation. His chest tightened. He had seen his share of dark things in life, but never this. This wasn't death they had uncovered. This was the fight of someone who had been trapped, someone who had clawed at the wood hoping to be heard. "Keep the lanterns steady," he barked up at the villagers. The circle of light grew tighter, more focused. Shadows stretched across the pit, making the rescuers' movements look frantic, almost frantic silhouettes dancing in the night. The deputy wedged a crowbar under the lid, his jaw clenched, his face pale. The wood groaned, splitting slightly as he applied pressure. Titan let out a sharp bark, almost like encouragement. Then came the sound again, faint, muffled, but undeniably alive. A soft scratching, a shallow gasp, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some women began to sob quietly, clutching their rosaries. Men bowed their heads, whispering prayers under their breath. The little girl in the blue dress, Emily, pressed her small palms together and whispered, "Please let them be okay." Her innocent voice pierced through the tension, making hardened men swallow back tears. The deputy pried harder. The lid cracked further, the wood splintering. A rush of air, cold and stale, burst upward, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and confinement. The crowd collectively recoiled, but Titan lunged forward, sniffing into the gap, his body trembling. He whined, then barked again, pawing at the wood as if to say, "Yes, yes, you're so close." "Almost there," Daniel shouted, his voice breaking. The rescuers grunted, sweat dripping down their brows as they fought against the stubborn nails and damp wood. With one final heave, the lid gave way. The crack widened, the sound echoing like thunder in the tense silence. Lantern light spilled inside, and what they saw froze every soul present. A child, fragile, malnourished, dirt smeared across a pale face, hair tangled and damp with sweat. The child's chest rose and fell in shallow, trembling breaths, each one a fragile fight to hold on. Tiny fingers twitched against the rough wood, nails chipped and broken from scratching. Eyes fluttered weakly, barely able to open against the sudden light. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some cried out, others covered their mouths in horror. Even Sheriff Daniels, who had always been steady as stone, felt his throat tighten and his eyes blur with tears. "My God," he whispered, "they're alive." The child let out the faintest sound, somewhere between a whimper and a gasp. It was so soft, yet it broke the silence like a cannon blast. The crowd erupted, sobs, prayers, cries of disbelief. Hardened farmers wept openly. Mothers fell to their knees. Even Deputy Clark, who had doubted all along, lowered his head and wiped at his eyes with a trembling hand. Titan leapt into the pit, pressing himself against the child as soon as the rescuers pulled them free. His tongue swept gently across the child's dirt-streaked cheek, his whines turning soft and tender, as though reassuring the little one that the nightmare was over. The child stirred faintly, a tiny hand twitching against Titan's fur, gripping weakly as if recognizing his savior. The rescuers worked quickly, wrapping the child in a thick blanket, passing them carefully up from the pit into waiting arms. Lantern light glowed against the fragile figure as if trying to protect them from the darkness that had nearly swallowed them whole. The crowd leaned in, their faces wet with tears, their breaths caught in their throats. Then another sound, a soft whimper. The rescuers looked back into the coffin and found a small puppy curled beside where the child had been. Weak, shaking, its ribs visible through its thin fur, but alive. Gasps rippled again as the puppy was lifted out, pressed against the chest of a villager who rocked it like an infant. By now, the field was filled with cries, prayers, and disbelief. Lanterns flickered against wet faces. The sheriff climbed out of the pit, his hands trembling, his voice hoarse as he declared, "This town will never forget this night. If not for this dog, we'd have lost them both." Titan stood proudly, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing in the firelight. He pressed himself close to the child once more, licking gently at their hand, refusing to move an inch away. His howls had brought them all here. His instincts had uncovered what no one else dared believe, and now his loyalty stood as the bridge between death and survival. The little girl Emily stepped closer, tugging at her mother's hand. "See," she whispered softly. He was calling for someone. He saved them. The sheriff heard her words, and though his voice cracked, he nodded. "Yes, child." He saved them. And with those words, the rescue was complete. Not just of a child and a puppy, but of an entire town that had been reminded of the power of loyalty, the strength of innocence, and the miracles that can be uncovered when one voice refuses to be silenced. The scene in the field was chaos and relief all at once. The child, wrapped tightly in a blanket, was rushed into the arms of paramedics who had arrived after the sheriff's urgent call. Their flashlights flickered against pale faces as they checked for breathing, pulses, and the faint beat of life that still lingered in the fragile body. The entire town watched, lanterns shaking in trembling hands, as the child was carefully placed onto a stretcher. The puppy, tucked inside another villager's coat, whimpered softly, clinging to warmth it had been denied for too long. Titan was not willing to let the stretcher leave his sight. His paws thudded against the wet ground as he trotted beside the paramedics, whining and pressing his nose against the child's blanket. Each time they shifted the stretcher, Titan barked once, sharp and urgent, as if reminding them to be gentle. The rescuers tried to shoo him away at first, but Sheriff Daniels raised a hand. "Let him come," he said firmly. "He's earned the right." The ambulance doors swung open with a metallic clang, and the stretcher was lifted inside. Just before the doors closed, Titan leapt, planting his front paws on the edge. His eyes locked onto the child's dirt-streaked face, and he let out a low whine that silenced everyone. The paramedics glanced at one another, then nodded. "Let him ride with us," one said softly. And so, the German shepherd climbed inside, curling himself against the stretcher, resting his head gently on the child's chest. His fur brushed against the child's weak hand, and though unconscious, the fingers twitched faintly, clutching at him as if holding on to hope itself. The siren wailed through the sleeping town, and people stepped aside, tears streaming down their cheeks as the ambulance sped past. Some raised their candles high, as though sending their prayers with the child. Others fell to their knees in the mud, whispering thanks for the miracle they had just witnessed. But all eyes followed Titan, the dog who had refused to give up, who now guarded the stretcher like a soldier guarding a king. At the hospital, the child was rushed into the emergency room. Doctors shouted instructions, nurses hurried with 4 lines, oxygen masks, and warm blankets. Yet through it all, Titan refused to move. When they wheeled the stretcher inside, he padded along, his claws clicking against the tiled floor. When the nurses tried to shut him out of the room, he pressed against the door, whining until one of the doctors relented. "Fine. Let him stay. He's not going anywhere anyway." From a corner of the room, Titan sat with his ears pinned forward, his eyes locked on the fragile child lying beneath the bright hospital lights. Whenever a monitor beeped, he tilted his head. Whenever the doctors leaned in close, Titan shifted too, watching every movement as though he understood what was happening. When the child's breaths grew shallow, he whimpered softly. When color began to return to their cheeks, his tail thumped faintly against the floor. Hours passed, long and heavy, but Titan never closed his eyes. He stayed awake through the night, guarding the hospital bed. Nurses brought him water, but he only lapped at it quickly before returning to his post. Visitors whispered in the hallway, their voices trembling as they spoke of the miracle in hushed tones. By dawn, the doctors emerged with tired smiles. Sheriff Daniels was waiting in the corridor, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. "Will the child make it?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. The doctor nodded. "It will take time, but yes, the child will live. Weak, malnourished, but alive." He paused, glancing back at the door. "And I don't think we can credit medicine alone. That dog kept them alive long before we arrived. His instincts, his persistence, without him, we'd never have looked." Sheriff Daniels swallowed hard, his eyes shining. He turned toward the nurses and said quietly, "Make sure the papers know this. This isn't just a rescue. It's proof of loyalty, proof of what love can do." Inside the room, Titan lowered his head onto the child's hand. The small fingers twitched again, curling slightly into his fur. It wasn't much, just the faintest grip, but it was enough to draw tears from the nurse who saw it. She whispered, "He knows. He knows who saved him." Word spread quickly through the town. By the following afternoon, people gathered outside the hospital with flowers, food, and tears of gratitude. Some left small candles by the door. Others brought treats and fresh water bowls for Titan. They didn't call him just a dog anymore. They called him a hero. Children drew pictures of him, their crayons scribbling his strong form beside the child he had saved. Old men tipped their hats when they heard his name. Even those who had once grumbled about his midnight howls now bowed their heads in respect. For Titan, none of this mattered. He didn't understand the headlines, the whispers, the admiration. He only knew the child was safe. He only cared that his watch had not been in vain. Wherever the stretcher went, he followed. Wherever the child was moved, he padded silently at their side. And every time those small fingers reached out, weak and trembling, Titan was there to meet them with warmth and patience. The sheriff visited again that evening, standing quietly by the hospital bed. He looked at Titan, then at the child, and finally spoke the words everyone was already thinking. "If not for this dog, we would never have checked. If not for Titan, this child would not be here tonight." His voice cracked, and for once in his long career, he did not hide it. The crowd outside the hospital applauded when they saw Titan emerge for a brief moment, stretching his tired legs. He stood tall despite his exhaustion, ears pricked, eyes glowing softly in the afternoon sun. He was no longer just a loyal pet. He was a symbol, a reminder of what devotion looked like, of how love could pierce through darkness and dig up miracles from the very earth. In the days that followed, the town seemed quieter, softer, almost reverent. Where there had once been frustration about sleepless nights and endless howls, there was now gratitude. People no longer spoke of Titan as the dog who disturbed their rest. They spoke of him with awe, as though he carried within him some secret gift that no human eye could see. Every corner of the town buzzed with the same story, of how a German shepherd refused to give up, of how his instincts uncovered life where death was assumed, of how loyalty had changed everything. The field, once avoided, no longer felt cursed. Lanterns and flowers now dotted the edges of the disturbed earth, left behind by villagers who came to see the place for themselves. Some stood silently, heads bowed in prayer. Others brought their children, pointing softly at the spot where Titan had clawed and howled, telling them, "This is where he saved a life. This is where a miracle was pulled from the ground." What had once been a patch of fear was now a place of reverence. The soil itself had become a symbol, a reminder that miracles can rise even from forgotten places. Titan remained close to the hospital in those first days, his paws pacing the tiled floors, his eyes never far from the child he had uncovered. Nurses and doctors grew used to his presence. He seemed to understand the rhythm of the place, the beep of monitors, the soft hush of voices, the quiet shuffle of shoes. At night, when the halls grew empty, he would curl up beside the bed, his body pressed gently against the frame, his ears twitching at every sigh and every movement. And always, the child's hand seemed to find its way into his fur, clutching weakly as though afraid to let go. Their bond grew quickly, faster than anyone could have imagined. When the child was finally strong enough to sit up, Titan was there, resting his chin on the blanket, his eyes soft and unblinking. When the first words were spoken, hoarse, weak, barely more than a whisper, Titan's ears perked, his tail thumped against the floor, and the entire room erupted in tears of joy. The doctors called it progress, but the townsfolk called it love. They said Titan was not just watching over the child. He was giving them the strength to live again. The sheriff visited often, his hat in his hands, his voice quieter than usual. Each time he stood by the bed, he repeated the same truth. If not for this dog, none of us would have known. None of us would have acted. He saw what we could not. Even the deputy, once skeptical, admitted openly that he had been wrong. He confessed to the townsfolk that he had doubted Titan, dismissed his howls, and nearly walked away. "But I'll never doubt again," he said, his voice trembling, "because tonight I saw loyalty dig deeper than reason, and it saved a life." Word of the rescue spread beyond the town. Newspapers carried the story, painting Titan as more than just a dog. He was called a guardian, a symbol of faith, a hero in fur. Letters arrived at the hospital from strangers who said they cried reading the story, who said they were reminded that love and loyalty still existed in the world. For a town so small it was rarely marked on a map, the tale of Titan and the child made it feel like the very heart of hope. But within the town itself, the lesson was simpler, pure. People no longer dismissed the instincts of animals as mere noise. They no longer brushed aside the possibility that loyalty could uncover truths that logic ignored. Parents held their children closer, reminded of how fragile and precious life was. Neighbors smiled more, spoke softer, as though the entire community had been humbled by what they had witnessed. They had seen how love could persist even in darkness, how loyalty could claw through the impossible, how miracles often waited in the places most forgotten. For Titan, none of this mattered. He did not care for headlines or praise. His world had narrowed to the small child he had refused to give up on. When the child laughed for the first time, faint but pure, Titan wagged his tail until his whole body shook. When the child reached out to rest against his fur, Titan leaned closer, steady and strong, like a guardian who had finally found his purpose. Their bond was not just friendship. It was survival woven into loyalty, a connection forged in the soil of fear and brought into the light of hope. One evening, when the child was finally strong enough to leave the hospital, the entire town gathered outside. Lanterns flickered against the twilight, candles glowed in the hands of villagers, and soft hymns rose in the air. The sheriff stood at the front, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "This child is alive because one dog refused to stop. Titan taught us something we had forgotten, that love and loyalty are forces stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, stronger than reason itself. As the child stepped out, holding tightly to Titan's fur, the crowd erupted into tears and applause. People knelt to stroke Titan's back, children hugged his neck, and flowers were laid at his paws. Yet through it all, Titan's gaze never wavered from the child. He stood tall, chest proud, but his loyalty was not for the crowd. It was for the life he had pulled from the earth, the soul he had refused to abandon. The town would remember the night forever, not as the night of fear, but as the night of faith restored. The field would no longer be whispered about with dread, it would be spoken of with reverence. And in the stories passed down, Titan's name would always be spoken with tears and gratitude. For in the end, the lesson was clear. Sometimes reason fails. Sometimes logic turns away. But love and loyalty, those silent, stubborn forces, can dig through the darkest soil and reveal miracles we never thought possible. There are some stories that do not fade with time. They linger, not because of the fear they once carried, but because of the light they revealed. What happened that night with Titan was not just a rescue. It was not just the uncovering of a child or the saving of a life. It was a reminder, a powerful reminder, that loyalty and love shine even in the darkest nights. Think of it. A dog, unable to speak our language, refused to stop crying out. He stood alone when people dismissed him. He howled when no one listened. He dug when others walked away. And in the end, it was his voice, his persistence, his unshakable loyalty that led to a miracle. If that is not love, if that is not faith, then what else can we call it? Perhaps this is why animals move us so deeply. They do not calculate. They do not weigh reason against risk. They feel. They know. And sometimes they sense truths that we cannot. Titan saw what an entire town could not see. He held on when logic told people to let go. And because of that, a child breathes today. I ask you now, as you sit and listen to this story, do you believe animals sense what humans cannot? Do you believe that loyalty has a power greater than reason? Maybe you have seen it in your own life. A pet that stayed by your side when no one else did, a dog that seemed to know when you were hurting, a companion that carried you through the shadows with nothing but their presence. If you have, then you know that Titan's story is not just a story. It is a truth. This town will never be the same. The field that once carried whispers of fear is now a place of reverence. The child who once gasped for air now laughs with Titan at their side. And the people who once doubted now tell their children, listen when a dog cries. Watch when a dog refuses to move. Sometimes they know more than we ever will. And now I turn to you, the one listening, the one watching, the one holding this story in your heart. If this tale touched you, if it stirred something inside you, do not keep it to yourself. Share it. Share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles are real. Share it with someone who needs hope. Because in a world that often feels heavy, in a time when doubt runs louder than faith, stories like this matter. They remind us that loyalty still exists, that love can still break through the soil of despair, and that sometimes the smallest voices, or the loudest howls, can reveal the greatest truths. This was not just a rescue. This was a reminder that love never quits, a reminder that loyalty never stops digging, and a reminder that sometimes the truest miracles come wrapped in fur, standing guard in the night, waiting for us to finally listen.